Hey guys, Derek here from Back to Reality. So for the past month and a half or so, we've been pretty focused on trying to finish our final harvest for the season, figure out a way to store our surplus, and prepare our gardens for a long, cold winter. However, there's also one other task that we've recently completed that doesn't exactly fit with that overall theme. And I'm of course talking about planting garlic. Now we've discussed garlic quite a bit in the past, but as you may recall, we've also recently been trying to increase the size of our crop by expanding our growing area. And so today I'd like to give you a really quick update on how we've actually planted our garlic in our newly constructed Flipped-Sod raised beds. If you haven't seen our previous videos on this topic, then it's probably best you check those out first. So as usual, I've placed some links in the description. But for everyone else, here's a really quick recap. Here in Canada, where our northern climate means a shorter growing season, garlic is typically planted in November, right before the first frost. This allows our plants to sprout roots before going dormant for winter and provides a good head start when the ground finally thaws in early spring. This is our third year growing garlic, and as I mentioned, our crop has been steadily increasing with each passing season. In our first year, we spent $20 for about 35 bulbs from a local farmer, and after breaking them up, we planted 260 individual cloves in a small 10 by 20 Ruth Stout bed, just outside our garden fence. By the following summer, each of the cloves had transformed into tall, leafy plants, and when we finally harvested them in late August, our initial $20 investment had multiplied itself by about 10 times. Or at least it would have if we had sold them at a local market. But we didn't. Instead, we once again broke them apart and this time replanted 1,000 cloves and saved the rest for gradual consumption and long-term preservation in the form of garlic salt. But going from 260 to 1,000 is a pretty big jump, so first we had to expand our growing area, which we did by digging a series of trenches, flipping over the sod and topsoil, and shifting them all to the right. The end result was 5 raised beds that were 50 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 16 inches tall. In each, we planted 2 rows of 100 cloves, each spaced 6 inches apart. Now fast forward to this year, and I'm sure you can see where this is going. As we mentioned back in September, our goal for this season was to dig another 5 raised beds and double our crop to 2,000 plants, which would mean multiplying our initial $20 investment by about 100. Not bad for only 3 years and a bit of sweat equity. But that's when we finally started considering another important gardening topic: crop rotation. Essentially, when planting the same crop over and over again in the same spot, you risk depleting the soil of specific nutrients and amplifying the effects of any possible pests. This is especially prevalent when planting monocultures because all of the plants have the same nutrient requirements and suffer from the same diseases. But it's important to point out that this is rarely a problem in nature, because nature rarely produces true monocultures. Instead, the natural world is filled with complex ecosystems made up of many different types of plants and animals all living together. So, two common methods for preventing this monoculture problem are to instead simply plant polycultures, which we do in much of the rest of our garden, or by never planting the same crop in the same place for too many years in a row. Or in other words, rotating your crops. So that's why after completing our 10th raised bed earlier this year, we decided to abandon the first 5. At least as far as garlic is concerned, and instead planted cover crops of buckwheat and white Dutch clover. And as painful as it is, we'll just have to revisit those beds next year once we've come up with a proper plan. For example, we may plant an early season crop in the spring that can be replaced with next season's garlic once the early crop has been harvested. Or we may end up digging another 5 raised beds next summer and create a 3-year garlic rotation between the 15. But in any case, that's all a future problem, so let's get back to this year's garlic. Because despite now having doubled the growing area, we'd still only be using the same amount of space as last year. So what about increasing our crop size? Well, depending on who you ask, most people space their garlic every 4 to 8 inches in order to provide enough room for the bulbs to grow large and full. And we chose to cut the difference and go with 6 inches, mostly because it made for some easy math. You see, with 50-foot rows, a 6-inch spacing meant that each row would contain 100 plants. Simple, no thinking required. And as I mentioned, last year we planted 2 rows per bed, but each bed is 2 feet wide, which gave us a row spacing of 8 inches. So this year, in order to maximize our yield, we decided to simply squeeze in a 3rd row, meaning that each bed will now contain 300 plants, each spaced about 6 inches in all directions, giving us a total of 1,500 plants, or an increased crop size of 50%. It's not quite the doubling that we were originally going for, but it's still a massive amount of garlic. And again, it'll buy us some time to figure out a more long-term strategy for our crop rotations. Oh, and by the way, if any of you have any suggestions about that, please feel free to let us know in the comments. Okay, so once we had the beds constructed and our spacing determined, the next step was to prepare our garlic for planting. And again, we've covered this before, but essentially all we did was break apart the bulbs, being careful not to damage any of the individual cloves. Luckily, this is a pretty easy job that requires very little concentration, so we chose to break apart our garlic first thing in the morning over coffee. But here's a tip: it's best that you brew a full pot, because this is gonna take a while. In fact, believe it or not, this was actually the most time-consuming part of the entire planting process. But once we finally counted out 1,500 cloves, we were ready to bundle up and head outside. Now, actually planting garlic is pretty easy as well. Poke a hole twice as deep as the clove is tall and drop it in pointy side up. Then cover it with soil and move on to the next one. But 1,500 cloves means 1,500 holes, so we decided to speed things up a bit by using this homemade hole poker thing. Okay, so we clearly need to work on the name, but the design and construction was incredibly simple, and it was very cheap too. I simply used 3 5-foot-long garden stakes and some scrap 1x4 strapping. It literally took about 15 minutes, and I held it together with brad nails because they were handy. Sure, I'd make it more sturdy next time, but honestly, this was just a last-minute idea last season, and it held up well enough to reuse it again this year. So that's 2,500 holes for less than $5 worth of material and 15 minutes worth of energy. Not bad. Plus, because the hole pokers are already properly spaced out, it also removes the task of measuring. Just make the first set of holes by plunging it in the ground, and then line up the next set by placing the first poker into the last hole of the previous set. Continue that down the row, and they'll all be perfectly spaced without ever reaching for the measuring tape. Once again, no thinking required. Oh yeah, and we also offset our middle row slightly so that the holes line up halfway between the others. I can't imagine that this will actually make much of a difference, but technically it'll give each hole an extra inch or so on either side. Plus, the pattern just looks kind of pretty. After that, we simply got to work at inserting the garlic, and we found the rows to be a good width for 2 people working from either side. But it would have been just as easy for 1 person, albeit a bit slower. Once all of the garlic was planted, all that was left was to cover the rows with a thick layer of hay, both to insulate them for the winter and to smother out any weeds that might try to grow in the spring. We also normally would have watered everything at that point, but the forecast called for several days of rain starting later that evening, so we didn't bother. And that was it. Another crop planted and another chore finished before winter. But as usual, we've also learned a few things along the way, so let's chat really quickly about some of the things we might do differently next year. First of all, our rows. Because in hindsight, I think we would choose to create shorter rows in the future. You see, long straight rows make a lot of sense when using mechanized equipment to perform the majority of your planting and harvesting tasks. However, they can also make things a bit more difficult when doing those things entirely by hand. Because unlike a tractor, people can easily move around in all directions, and so the most efficient path is usually a straight line from point A to point B. But when point A is in the middle of one 50-foot row and point B is in the middle of another, a straight line is no longer possible. And so the whole situation can seem a little bit restricted. At this point, I think the easiest solution would be to simply add a couple of walking paths that cut across the rows in order to make movement more efficient. We'll have to take that into account when expanding this garden again in the future. But on the other hand, another short-term solution is to simply work within the existing rows in a more efficient way. For example, when we unloaded our most recent pile of hay prior to mulching, we placed the pile here. And that worked great for the row closest to the pile, but made mulching every other row more difficult. However, if we would have simply placed the pile here instead, then every movement would have been a nearly straight line automatically, making the entire job more efficient. Anyway, if you're considering the construction of similar raised beds in your garden, I'd personally recommend 20 to 30 feet as your maximum row length. That's closer to what we've done in the rest of our garden layout, and we find navigating around those beds considerably more reasonable. And finally, I'd like to really quickly touch on garlic varieties. Because when we first made that $20 investment, we simply took whatever the garlic farmer was selling, which in our case was half music and half purple Russian. But there's so many other varieties to choose from, each with their own unique characteristics and flavors. So this year, we decided to add 4 new varieties to the mix: German White, German Red, Legacy, and Elephant. We're really looking forward to tasting all these new varieties next year because, like most people, we're used to simply eating whatever's sold in the grocery store, usually just labeled garlic. But that's one of the many advantages of growing your own food. You get to try new varieties and then grow more of the ones you prefer. For instance, I never really appreciated the subtle differences between tomato varieties until we started growing them ourselves. So maybe the same will be true for garlic as well. Guess we'll find out. But in the meantime, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.